Hi there. In this lecture we see a very instructive game, Akiba Rubinstein against George Salwe. This is in 1908, the Lodz tournament round 3. So we see d4 from Rubinstein, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5, c takes d5, e takes d5, knight f3, knight f6. So this is a Tarrasch defense where black is trying for piece activity at the expense of structure a little bit, because black now has an isolated queen's pawn. And the thing about this, how do we punish this? Well, sometimes helping black seemingly repair the structure is the punishment, because we can have a more exploitable set of weaknesses, like c5 in front of this pawn potentially could be used to lock down the opponent's position. If queen takes c6, knight takes d5, it's just winning a pawn for not much. So b takes c6, white castles, bishop e7, and now knight a4. So trying to press on the c5 square here, we have bishop e3, and now black castles, and now rook c1. So it's restraint against the c6 pawn. So this is important, this restraint. We have bishop g4, f3, bishop e6, and now trying to exchange off that guardian bishop of the dark squares. Well, black can't really do anything about it because of the rook on f8. So rook f8, rook f2. And now it's undesirable to move this bishop to a more passive square. So we have knight d7. The bishops get exchanged off. And now queen d4, so keeping that lock and key over the c5 square. We have rook e8, bishop f1. We have rook ec8 and now e3, so the queen is attacked. She goes to b7, knight c5, not minding simplification here. So this is an interesting situation. So rook c7 is a little bit of an inaccuracy. a5 is actually important to stop white playing b4. And it seems here, this is not an automatic win just because the structure is, shut down a bit. It's not an automatic win. Let's say a3, bishop f5. It's actually going to be quite a bit of work potentially from this position. We can get a nice position where, black's kind of a statue here. But how do we actually win here? There might be many more plans needed. For example, later, maybe the h-pawn to come up, maybe bishop to come on this diagonal, maybe the e4 break to try and open up things. And an undertone here, by the way, is trying to get a rook to the 7th rank. So these kind of plans, that could join up on f7, or the queen could be used on d3 later. There's all sorts of plans, but there's work to do here. Now, that work capability is part of the main advantages here, that the opponent hasn't got any strategic pawn break. So we do have a lot of plans left to try and win this position, because we can involve e4, which opens up more the 5th rank, which can lead to the 7th rank, and it can lead to greater pressure on this diagonal or this diagonal. If that diagonal is broken because there's no pawn on d5, then you can see the e4 break can have big implications later. But it does seem as though a5 would have been pretty stubborn here. So okay, for rook c7 was played. We have rook fc2. Here again, b4 it seems the most accurate, just to stop a5 from black. So it's more of a statue. Black's more of a statue, and we can still look forward to later maybe preparing an e4 break, or b5 as well. Black has to worry about b5. So, okay, rook fc2. We have queen b6, b4 now, a6. So black's gone into this kind of statue, frozen statue structure. If a5 here, yeah, we can just take on a5. We're hitting the queen. We're hitting a8. If queen b7, we take on a8. Thanks very much. b5, big advantage. If queen takes d4, we interpose. Rook takes a8, check, and then we've just won. We'll take the queen after. So a6 is played. Rook a5. So that hits the queen, and we have rook b8 here, which doesn't do too much to help black. But what else? If queen takes d4, e takes, this is a miserable position with a6 under fire. And let's say rook b7, a3, and black gets very passive. We can start to make progress gradually here. So this position is pretty comfortable for white. So for example here, we can improve our king. We've got a greater wealth of possibilities, basically, and say this kind of thing happens, we could end up in a better endgame, a rook and pawn ending. If queen b7, this is also pretty stubborn, and I just want to show you how we might progress here. We can play h4 to try and fix the light squares on the king side, to try and make black even more frozen. And it gives us these interesting plans here that we can just build up on c6 again and now play e4. So that's the advantage. We're not frozen and we have a pawn break, which means we can open up things, which means we might be able to get a rook on the 7th. We might be able to hit f7 and h7 at some point. So here, d takes, bishop takes e4. This is just an excuse for these more direct plans. Putting, keeping the opponent's pieces busy. We can now play rook d5. The thing is, you might find this in your own games, that in practice, you never seem to win these isolated queen-pawn games, because maybe sometimes you're too quick just to win a pawn out of it. If we're too quick to win a pawn here, it gets frightening. It severely gets frightening, because our king is quite weak here. After queen e7, we've got frightening, threats, like queen e1. And this position, say rook bd8, it looks scary. White's advantage is minimal. Okay, we finally hit f7, but our advantage is minimal. So actually, in this kind of scenario, we shouldn't try and win material. We should try and get to f7 and h7, or both. This position, so using this pin, queen c5, rook e5, we can get to the 7th rank and start hitting f7. This is more one way, and it's like making it more of an attack situation where we're hitting f7. So here queen c2 looking at h7, here rook e7, and now look at this, we've got a bishop a2 threat. So this is much more of a one-way situation rather than trying to win that pawn earlier. So here check, queen c5, we don't mind the exchange of queens because this is now utterly miserable for black. This position, we're just winning material. We're in a much more clear situation for winning the endgame here. So it's interesting that, I just wanted to show you what would happen on a really stubborn defense. It's not what you might think. It's not about necessarily winning c6. We've always got to bear in mind the opponent's counterplay. Having a plan of getting a rook to the 7th rank is a really, really dangerous idea in general if we're hitting these targets laterally. But you see that also the e4 break is instrumental to make progress and keeping it a one-way street to the opponent. But in the game, things were made kind of easier with rook b8, after a3, rook a7. This is just losing material. The opponent really didn't offer resistance. If instead of rook a7, queen takes d4 had been played, e takes, king f8, king f2, this situation, we're just picking up a6, no problem. If rook cb7, we're just going to take on a6 again. There's no problem here. So we're going to make progress from here. So rook a7 was played, and now guess what we can play here for 10 points. So this is an easy nut to crack compared to what we've just seen, by the way. This is an easy nut to crack. It's less controversial. Yeah, we can just take on c6. Well done if you found this. Rook takes c6. So queen takes c6 is played. Queen takes a7. We have rook a8. There's not really much counterplay here to speak of. Queen b7, king f2, h5, bishop e2, g6, and now queen d6. And there is a plan of getting, well, there's the extra pawn to exploit, but also the rook can be active. Rook c5, so h4, a5. We have a rook on the 7th here, which makes its presence felt. So here b5. So anytime, king g7, it's a bit of a worry because of that pin. B6, queen takes e6 is a bit of a worry. So in the game, though, a4 is played, b6. And now, if the king moves, there is a concern potentially about queen takes e6 under the right situation, not allowing queen takes e7. Under the right situation, there's a concern. But here, rook a5 was played, and now b7 ends actually the game. There's a huge tactic available to white here in the form of rook c8 check and winning the queen. Black resigned here. If rook a7, then rook c8 check, and then taking off the queen. Instead of king g7, then we can use rook takes f7 check and win the queen like this. So yes, it's a game which seems to be, you know, strategically based on structure, but what is the actual major agenda if black had been a lot more stubborn? So this is the fascinating thing. If black had been a lot more stubborn here around this situation with queen b7, it's fascinating to think one of our key advantages here is that we're much more flexible than the opponent. What do we choose to use that flexibility for? What agenda? Well, breaking a rook to the 7th rank, having a one-way street agenda should be taken for granted. We don't want to have frights about the opponent's threats and counterplay. So what we evidenced in the analysis here, let's just recap. In this stubborn scenario, this is really for me one of the more fascinating behind the scenes things about this, that we can prepare and build up and improve until the e4 break, and that gives us even more opportunities, and we might want to bypass just winning a pawn here. So this method instead is a way of breaking a rook into the 7th rank, and then all of a sudden we're visiting f7 sometimes. So once we get this scenario, it's dangerous for bishop a2, dangerous for f7 and h7 and black's king in general. So queen c2 creating more weaknesses, and then look at this. So this would be much more ideal than winning the c6 pawn. So even though we, you know, start off positionally, what do we get? We get the opponent in a frozen state basically, and we might have more flexibility. So that's one of the key things. The opponent in a frozen state, then we can pursue aggressive plans for infiltration without any counterplay or things to worry about. We don't want to be worrying about the opponent's threats, tactics and combinations. That's for sure. So this kind of plan is much more dynamic and to the point. And yeah, black's, you know, on the breaking point here because of the king side and bishop a2 being a threat. So if they didn't want queen b6, we have bishop a2 coming, and then, you know, the structure's collapsing as we're pinning the f7 pawn. The rook on the 7th is often, you know, a killer strategy, basically. So linking that up with exploiting the backward pawn is instrumental in these behind-the-scenes variations. But yeah, the opponent put up very little resistance in the game. So this is an easier exercise to find this tactic. It's a much easier exercise. So we're a pawn up, and then Rubinstein is still very careful, not giving the opponent any counterplay, any real counterplay. So yeah, it's crushing in the end, and it's a very nice tactic, of course, with the passed pawn winning here, if it had continued. But the game ended on b7. So an instructive game, and also behind the scenes, think about that concept. When we tie the opponent up, they're in a kind of frozen statue state, and we might still have a pawn break available. What are we using all of this for? It's not just to win a pawn. That's a bit of a low ambition, especially low, even lower if the opponent gets counterplay. So if we can actually get a rook to the 7th, we can cause a lot of carnage and destruction, you know, for winning material and mating. It's a much bigger goal, and if it, especially amplified when there's even less counterplay than the scenario of winning a pawn. So we got a much more aggressive goal with minimal counterplay compared to a lesser goal of winning a pawn with a lot of counterplay. What do you choose? So yeah, it's interesting to uncover some ideas like this from this highly celebrated game. Okay, thanks so much. All comments, questions, likes and subscribes, really appreciated. Thanks so much.